This is Marketing Careers Uncovered, and I'm Dave Hayward. It's not every day that you come across an absolute powerhouse with experience that spans a whole array of different worlds. We're talking financial services, fast-moving consumer goods, startups, and even the world of political campaigning. Natasha Plowman joins us today to share some of her experiences and how she's progressed and some of the lessons that she's learned along the way. To give you a little flavour, she's held roles including Global Head of Communication Strategy at HSBC, Head of Corporate Affairs at the beverage titan Diageo, and she's even led social impact campaigns like This Girl Can for Sport England. So she's really worn lots of different hats, and I really can't wait to get into it all. So Natasha, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and what you're doing at the moment?
Thanks. It's great to be here, Dave. So where am I at the moment? I mean, I'm also continuing to wear lots of different hats. My main hat at the moment is my own kind of independent consultancy, Spinning Red, which sees me go from working on strategy and reputation and communication strategy with clients through to training them on media or narrative or developing storytelling workshops. But it all comes back down to that whole area around corporate reputation is definitely the mainstay of where I tend to focus my time.
And as well as you can, could you give us a bit of a flavour of what a typical day or week looks like in that world?
As I'm sure anyone who works independently could say, there is no single day. So one day, like I was saying, like last week, I was in Dubai with a client, training, doing some media training and narrative training with them. And then this week, I've spent a lot more time at home in my trackies, catching up on what's happening in the world, catching up what's happening, what the key issues are for businesses. And I think a big part of what I need to do is keep abreast of the news, keep abreast of kind of opinion, and particularly when it comes to geopolitics and as it impacts business. So you go from kind of being very focused on client to putting your head above the parapet and just seeing what's happening in the world and what are the interconnections that kind of impact business more broadly. So no two days tend to be the same. And then other days I'm kind of ferrying my daughter around into her various activities or cooking dinners and all of that kind of normal human stuff that people do as well.
So everything that's going on with geopolitics now, keeping up as a full-time job in itself.
Always. And you can't keep abreast of everything. And I think that's the thing that kind of can make you kind of get into this, you can't know everything that's going on in the world or read everything. And there's so much opinion, and there's so much noise, and there's so much competing information always at it. And I think that's a real problem with a lot of people who work in kind of the various communications and marketing fields, is that you get overwhelmed with the amount of stuff that's just out there and that we contribute to as well.
So what do you enjoy most about what you're doing at the moment?
I like the diversity of the different work. I like meeting new people and new organizations and working with people of all different types of organizations and ages and different parts of their career and types of roles. I mean, the luxury of being independent is you get to have all those different coffee meetings and get to meet different people and hear what's going on in their world and what their pain points are and what the opportunities are for what they're doing with their particular employer or the work they're doing. So that part I love doing. And I find it really energizing just having all those different conversations. And I think, a big thing that I've committed to this year is to have more conversations, to have more human connection, to listen and to learn different points of view and different perspectives and get out of that echo chamber that we always talk about. And, and I do get the opportunity to do that, which is great.
What's the cloud to the silver lining? What are the bits for a little bit more challenging and, let's say, less fun?
Look, it's chasing where the next bits of work are coming from. I mean, that's always the hardest bit. It's building the pipeline. It's getting clarity around what your offer is and making sure that you're getting that offer to the right people, in front of the right people. It's, having to kind of plan and see where things might be going on in that pipeline. I mean, that's the bit that I've always, and I think a lot of independent people can struggle with, is that kind of pipeline of activity and that surety and just managing the roller coaster of kind of where work might come into, but also being able to maintain the boundaries around what you can do and what you can't do and make sure that it has some balance to life, because, work is fascinating, interesting and engaging, but it's one facet of life as well. And I think maintaining those boundaries is always important as well.
Yeah, I know from experience that it can all quite easily take over, and you're your job and your role becomes your whole persona, and then before you know it, other parts of your life are just completely crumbling around you, aren't they?
Yeah. And for me, that was a conscious decision about what the choices I've made now around kind of how do I set those boundaries. I think I was more a risk of that when I was in house, where you became your entire being is in your, and like you say, your persona and who you are and how you show up to people is around what you do for work rather than who you are as a person. And I think that's something I've really consciously tried to focus on differently in the last kind of couple of years.
So that's where you are now. You actually had quite a different start to your professional life. Should we? Let's wind the clock back. Can you give us a little bit of a flavour of those early days and aspiration, where
Yeah.
you thought you might have been heading at that time?
So, as you can probably hear from my accent, which has had a bit of a top up of Australiana since I was just there for Christmas, which was brilliant. I grew up and was born in Australia. And my aspiration for life was to be the first female Australian Prime Minister. I was very kind of actively involved in politics, very interested in politics. Julia Gillard has took that mantle, which I'm absolutely fine with because I'm a complete fangirl of Julia Gillard anyway, and particularly the stuff that she's doing now. But I was always really fascinated with politics. And I was and so even at school, I was kind of quite politically active in the sense, but not from a party political perspective, just from, looking at what's right and what my values were around kind of fairness and openness and transparency, which are kind of those values which I think have been my mainstay throughout my entire career and who I am to this day. But I am doing the typical Australian thing. I travelled for a couple of years, did the backpacking thing, kind of worked on kibbutz in Israel. I kind of worked in various pubs and bars around London, kind of in the 90s, and finally went home to go to university in the mid 90s, where I did policy studies and industrial relations. And at university, I didn't get involved in a lot of the traditional politics at university, but I did get involved in setting up a organisation called Emily's List, which is known in Australia and also in America, and it's about getting more Labor women into positions of influence and power. So, and having a university-based club, it was a way of getting some of these really influential women to come onto campus and speak to us. So we had, the head of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. We had the Victorian Premier come on. So we had really high profile women come onto campus. And that was how I got involved in politics in Australia. And so I got involved in kind of local politics in the areas I was in. And I eventually, when I was still at university and finishing my degree, because I was also a mature age student, so I was kind of older than a lot of the other, so I took those couple of years out travelling. I worked for a Labor senator as a researcher. And the senator is like our upper house in Australia, but it's fully elected, and elected in proportional representation as well. And as a kind of a political researcher, that's when you're writing speeches, you're writing kind of briefing papers. Sometimes you get involved in some of the party politics stuff. Other times it's much more a policy side of things. I tend to lead to more policy side. And then from that job, I got a job with the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union as a policy advisor around trade policy, because at the time, in kind of 1999, 2000, 2001, big debates were happening around international trade, globalization. You had the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, focusing around kind of multinational guidances around multinational corporations and how they operate. So all these issues that we're talking about globalization now have been going on for decades. And so for me, the beginning stages were very much from the political perspective around what's the role of business, how can business show up in society more effectively? And that grounding and foundations of politics has definitely been, a huge learning ground for me, even kind of like, 25, 30 years later.
And you really have to know how to understand and work with people in that space. Probably more so than anywhere. I wouldn't call myself a political expert by any means, but it's pretty clear to me that the way things get done is through relationships and building those relationships and coalitions. So, with those skills, you were starting to really hone at that point in your life, as well, alongside all of the practical bits and pieces.
Definitely. And I think it's also kind of putting empathy and putting yourselves in the shoes of other people, understanding where their perspective lies and why they come at things from a certain angle. And I think they're kind of the certain skills that are hugely important about the human experience is kind of being able to empathize, being able to, and not something I've always done well as a kind of, when I was young. I mean, I think it's something you kind of get more comfortable with as you get older, but definitely kind of seeing the political connectedness of how things operate from business into society into kind of even the formal political realm is definitely an important part of kind of the linkages around humans operate to get how.
Some skills we need to relearn in our politics at the moment.
Yeah, well, this is it. I mean, and there's definitely a whole lot of, accepting difference and different point of views and acknowledging that difference is something we could all learn from on all sides of politics. But we seem to be in this kind of constant tussle of a black and white binary approach to politics, where actually humans are just iterations of grey. There's so much kind of things where you can agree with someone about something and not agree with them about something else, but become so tribal around that you can only agree with the people who agree with you 100%. And that's really problematic because it kind of closes you down to that conversation that you need to be having and closes you down to kind of really seeing where people's perspectives might lie.
Well, I can start to make some very obvious parallels between some of those attributes that help you become successful and how we might translate that over to the marketing space. The question I'm drawn to, first of all, really is, how did you get from politics to marketing? You could have had a very different trajectory.
Politics is communications, fundamentally. You can kind of couch it in any kind of dark art that a lot of people who work in public affairs and politics like to do, but it's all fundamentally around communications and understanding people and influencing people. So when I left Australia again in 2003, I thought I was working in charities at that time, and I came over to the UK to work in charities, and I worked in kind of a charity called Drug Scope, which was very much around drug policy. And my role was kind of public affairs and communications manager. So I'd gone from politics to kind of charities. And then I decided to kind of make the leap into the corporate world. So the mainstay has always been communications. It's always been kind of, how do you give messaging to people and kind of get people to kind of either think differently, feel differently, or do something differently. And that's kind of the fundamental core of what communications and marketing is. I think the fundamental difference for me from a marketing perspective is so much of what I do is around the ideas for people. So ideas around behavior change or attitudinal change, and how do you influence that? And that's where the politics is important. Whereas a lot of marketing is very much around kind of consuming a product, consuming a service, kind of wanting to kind of more the sales side of things. And that's where I think there's a fundamental difference between where you can take communications and corporate affairs and where marketing is. That doesn't mean there's not crossover, because there absolutely is, because the reputation of a business and the idea of a business is entwined with the products they sell and the services they sell as well, and where marketing has a role to play in it. So for me, it would tend to be much more of a kind of just a transition from kind of politics to charities to then my first big corporate job, which is you look back on it now, and I do look back on it now and kind of think my first big corporate job was with Coca-Cola Enterprises, which was, you go from working in small charities and political organizations to working in one of the biggest, the biggest consumer goods company in the world. And it was a shock to the system in lots of ways. I look back now on the naivety and somewhat the arrogance around what I knew and what I was doing and what I needed to learn. But I learned a huge amount around business and business opportunity, and the interconnection with business and politics as well, because a lot of the big issues that were concerned Coke at the time was the start of the obesity conversation. It was the start of the marketing to children conversation. And it was also kind of the beginning stages around the use of recycled plastic. How do you get surety supply of plastic bottles? And how do you ensure that kind of the businesses are able to kind of, get into that circularity conversation, which everyone thinks is quite new, but has been going on for nearly 20 years. And, but it was kind of a bit of a kind of feet to the fire going into that corporate world. But that was the transition I made into kind of really understanding marketing more, and the full marketing mix, going into that world.
What shocked you most? What were the biggest shocks to the system where that caught you a little bit perhaps unprepared?
Oh, I think it was. I mean, I think the naivety of kind of really kind of not understanding the commercial realities of what business was doing and what we needed to do. I was still very much in the wide-eyed kind of a world of kind of values, and I'm trying to think of the right word. Does that's kind of naivety, I suppose. And what I needed to learn really quickly was the language of business, and the language of the commercial realities of what businesses need to operate in, the trade-offs and the decisions they need to make around the different stakeholders and different entities they need to involve themselves in. So, that started at Coke, where I really, really kind of honed that understanding and that knowledge and that education, and kind of really started to understand kind of the commercials of a business, is when I moved to Diageo. And I did quite a few different roles in Diageo in the 7 or so years that I was there. But, that's where corporate reputation become much more understood as a discipline and as a focus. But also, I worked very closely with a lot of the commercial team. And so it gave me a really good insight into how do businesses make money? And if you don't know how your business makes money, and you don't know the kind of decisions they need to make around make money, then it's very difficult to influence, and to have a voice within business effectively.
And understanding what those limits are as well, because you can only push things so far until you start having a material impact on the bottom line somewhere. Then all of a sudden you'll find yourself running out of road very quickly, won't you?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where corporate reputation is such an interesting area, and why it's been the mainstay of my career, particularly since moving into more the corporate world, because they're the decisions you need to make. You can't, you have various stakeholders, have various demands, interests, and on what your business is doing. And while shareholders and the return on investment and the fact of how your business make money are absolutely critical, you also have other stakeholders that need to be kind of heard, understood, and be able to influence. For Diageo, of course, a big part of that was around responsible marketing. So how did they ensure, they had to demonstrate they were marketing responsibly, and that includes not marketing to underage people, really focusing on ensuring that people weren't drinking and driving. There was kind of a growing focus on, educating women in particular not to drink while pregnant. And so all of those codes and areas became a much more important way. So you needed to kind of have that social lens as well as the commercial. And, at the time when all those codes were coming into play, people were thinking, oh, we're not going to be able to kind of market freely. We're not going to be able to build our brands in the right way. We're not going to be able to do things. And what it actually we saw was it gave that the constraints gave more freedom in some ways, but it kind of gave freedom that was kind of had guardrails to ensure they were marketing responsibly. And, those trade-offs and those decisions are incredibly important kind of for a responsible company. For me, I was kind of at the center of that because I was the person who signed off a lot of the marketing. But, with that lens of what the brand needed to do, what the brand was trying to say, as well as what the codes and what the regulations and what stakeholders expected us to do as a responsible company.
So you've got to build some really positive working relationships here, but also you're potentially in a position where you could quite easily be seen as the person who says no. Don't put this in front of Natasha. She'll say, "Oh no, we can't do this. We can't do that." How do you go about building those positive relationships where actually you're seen more as a partner, unless there's a blocker, as these things can tend to be?
That role had always been seen as a blocker, and it was always seen as the people who said no. And I really, when I took on that role, my focus was that I wanted to not be that, and be that, like you say, be that partner to kind of drive the brands forward. And I think the big one was to you had to understand the brand as well. and you had to understand what the brand was trying to achieve, who the target market for that brand was, and then overlay that with some of the considerations you needed to make around to ensure that it fulfilled the codes. So one of the brands that I always had most fun with and kind of the most I had most contact with was always Captain Morgan, and Captain Morgan because it was a brand that had a real tone of voice and a personality. Using humor is really hard when you're trying to kind of navigate, can this be seen as being something attractive to children or young people will find funny, while also being really adult and really focused, and how do you kind of have those lines and where those lines would be drawn. And so much of that tends to be around intuition and building the relationships and trying to kind of find out what was important and what wasn't important to the brand and where you could push and where you needed to hold back. And so that dialogue was always an important part to make sure that was an effective relationship. And what we saw was the relationship between corporate affairs and the role we were playing got stronger and stronger and stronger, is because I think I made the effort to kind of understand what the brand needed and kind of listened to what they wanted to do, and wasn't dogmatic in the kind of what we could say no, but then tried to be that partner around, because it's grey. It's all iterations of grey. And that used to always be my favorite phrase around where you could push and where you couldn't. And I had great partners with the legal function. And it's always a running joke in a lot of ways when you kind of, legal. No, you think corporate affairs, the people say no, then you've got legal. But we had a great relationship with them because we brought each other's perspectives and were able to balance each other out and then bring the brand into that conversation as well. But yeah, it's definitely the iterations of grey is the focus for that.
Yeah, and working in partnership in a positive fashion like that, it actually gives you more license to say no and be listened to when it's needed, rather than, okay, it's just Natasha again. She's really thought about it. She understands what we're trying to achieve. A block is being put up for a very good reason. Let's have a proper conversation about it, rather than everyone throwing their toys out of the pram.
And that helps no one. And it doesn't move the brand forward. It doesn't move the business forward. And Diageo marketeers, they own the codes. But yes, it has to be those relationships. And it has to be that they needed to trust that I had their best interests at heart. And I needed to trust that they weren't trying to pull the wool over my eyes. And so there was a real openness and transparency in the relationship, which is incredibly important. And that taught me a lot about marketing. I come from a communications perspective. I come from a political background. And it was that point in time that I really started understanding brands. I understand the commercial reality of what brands are trying to do. I started to understand, what the levers that you can pull to drive a brand forward and to kind of get that pathway to purchase and make sure you're influencing your shopper or your consumer in different points in that pathway. And so I had the great opportunity to be able to do the Diageo Way of Brand Building course. So I was kind of in contact with marketeers. So there was, I loved that. And I found it really, really interesting. And I think that experience has also enabled me in kind of my future roles and future career to understand those marketing levers a lot more effectively, and being able to kind of overlay them with what the corporate reputation needs are of businesses as well.
And you touched on something really important there in terms of really understanding what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes, where they're coming from, their perspectives, understanding commercial reality. I think that's something that we've talked quite a lot on here in terms of marketers understanding the commercial focus of businesses that they work in. Let's hark back to Coca-Cola. You're going in, you're realizing, okay, I really need to understand how this business works commercially. What were some of the practical things that you did to get a better understanding and build a picture and understand, okay, I might need to operate slightly differently as to how I might have done in earlier roles?
I think it's listening to what different people's pain points are, I suppose. And I think, like one of the people I'm still in contact, the only person I'm still in contact with from Coke, he was in the commercial and the supply chain side of the business. And I think, understanding what his pain points were around kind of making sure that he, the costs of understood the implications of the choices they make for the cost of goods. So the cost of goods sold and the COGS around a brand. And, you could say all these great things around kind of having a really lovely bottle or a kind of a point of sale activation, but then someone needs to price it up. And then sometimes you need to kind of make sure and understand margin conversations and understand, when, and I think one of the things I always found fascinating is those debates around when you want to go, we're looking at value versus volume and can you drive sales and how that then the implications on your profit and your bottom line when you kind of discount too much, which might drive your volume and get a nice figure for volume, but the value and the margin you're getting is getting lower. And I think, for me, it was listening in on those conversations and kind of connecting the dots together around how they all work together was the opportunity to understand how the business operated more. And I think, it's that kind of openness to kind of people come at things from different perspectives. And the more you listen and learn and really actively listen into what they're kind of trying to do and then be able to connect it, then the more you're likely to learn how the business operates really effectively and not get so blinded or so kind of tunnel visioned into this is what my role is. But then because we're all just parts and parcel of a greater entity in a business. And, Coke was definitely kind of a small training ground. I mean, I think where I really got an understanding of that was when, again, at Diageo, where, again, I sat on the commercial leadership team and I also sat on the innovation leadership team as the communications person. But I got to see, being at that table, I got to listen to what people were talking about. I got to listen to the problems and the conversations and the debates they were having, and then being able to kind of then see how that then impacted what my contribution was and what my role would be to build the reputation of the brand.
And so once you put it like that, going from politics to comms and marketing doesn't seem that strange at all, really. They are very similar skill sets that you could very easily transfer into those roles and spaces.
And that's the human experience. That we have to remember that this is all about humans and human interaction and human choices and human decisions. And, we will talk probably a bit around the role of technology and where technology is going. But those foundations around understanding people's motivations and desires and why we do the certain things we do are such a critical part of anything that we do around kind of marketing, no matter what part of the marketing mix you're in.
And so perhaps that's the perfect segue then. We've talked a lot about those relationship building pieces, but in a world that is constantly, ever more dominated by technology that seems to be attempting and succeeding in many ways to rip us away from those quite essential interactions. How are you sort of balancing the benefits of technology-led approaches and also really keeping close to the people and relationships that matter?
Yeah, I think technology is, and like the kind of advent of different types of technology are amazing tools, but they're tools to drive human behavior and human action and human thought. They're not tools to an end that doesn't involve some human element to it. And for me, that's that mainstay. And I kind of find that, the more we give over our decision making, our power, our influence to something else that doesn't kind of entail that human experience, that's becoming the bigger problem. It's kind of like when people say, oh, Copilot or someone or ChatGPT can tell you that information. And it can, but it can tell you the information within the silos and within the confines of what they've been given that information to. And sometimes you need to have someone to kind of connect up that nuance and that humanity into the information you get. So I'm kind of, and I think, of course, the use of mobile phones, the kind of the ability to access information really quickly is really good, but it's also contributing to huge amounts of noise and a huge amount of just mind-blowing amount of knowledge that you possibly have at your fingertips. And we contribute to that. We contribute as kind of marketeers and as communications people, we contribute constantly to this noise because we want to have our influence, we want to have our visibility, we want to have that cut through. And because these platforms are after more and more content, it just makes people unable to kind of decipher between what they need to find out and what they don't need to find out. And that kind of just, ability to kind of cut through. So I find, it's an area that I'm kind of been pondering a lot lately around, how can we sometimes say less And which is the irony is here, kind of we're doing another podcast, which is kind of contributing again to more information into the ether. But it's but how do we ensure we get that cut through, but also ensure that people have the tools to be able to decide what's important and what's not important? It's again, it's something I've been pondering a lot lately, but I just think that's going to be the real catalyst for people to either withdraw completely, which I think is a problem, or just get so overwhelmed that they've got no idea what they kind of think or feel or what they want to do differently because of this kind of constant stream of information that's coming at them all the time.
Yeah, and it's quite a dilemma as well, because on one hand, so if I needed to put together, let's make something up here, a strategy for a new product launch. Now, I could either sit in a dark room with something like Copilot or ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, and I could jabber away with that, probably come out with something that might look and appear coherent at a surface level, or I could spend arguably longer talking to people across the business, customers, really working through the problem and challenge with other people, and come out with a better result. But yeah, it's slower, it's more time intensive, but the outcome will be better. But I'm seeing more and more of people tending to opt for the easier, quicker option, which is pulling on data sources that are available to everyone. And I think there's a real risk here that we all ultimately trot out broadly the same approaches, the same thinking around topics that AI or large language model can spit out very, very convincing sounding answers and arguments, but ultimately it's all the same shade of beige.
Yeah. And I think that's also kind of my problem. And this is also one of the things like where experience becomes so much more important, because, you can't go away from that kind of intuition and that gut feeling, or that kind of ability to ask different questions that you get with experience and you get with kind of having seen things happen before, because all of this is cyclical. It all goes around in cycles. Nothing here is fundamentally, a lot of things, nothing is really, really new. Maybe the channels, the tools and stuff that we use kind of might be new, but the kind of the approach and the kind of the theory behind things is fairly similar. And I think this is one of the biggest problems, is that kind of like, we become more vanilla and become more like, vanilla or beige or any other kind of analogy of that. And it's because you're all inputting from the same information that's there, rather than kind of looking for those kind of little nuggets and those shiny nuggets around with creativity that come from conversation, that come from, listening to diverse voices and listening to and looking at different ways that people operate and how they kind of come together. And I think so I'm hoping that technology kind of enables that ability to ask questions to a broader cross-section of people. That can be a really good thing. But when it becomes so much more kind of siloed and everyone become just asking the same people the same questions or the same platforms, then I think your pool of inspiration becomes ever smaller, which I think is problematic for brands and for marketeers to kind of go down that path.
Heading back to your corporate career for a moment, at what point did you decide to set up shop yourself? What was the catalyst and thinking behind that?
So I left Diageo when I had my daughter, and I was a geriatric mum at the grand old age of 39 of having her. And we would only be able to have one, so she was a bit of a miracle baby, which is amazing.
Such an unpleasant term, though, isn't it? Geriatric mum.
I know.
You've pushed on a sore point with me, with me there. I mean, in what other realm is 39 considered geriatric? The mind boggles. So talk about a communications fuck up there.
I know, it is absolutely. The language is important and these things we use, but I owned it at the time and kind of with my geriatric mum and And so I decided to kind of take some time out and just kind of be that mum, which was great for a period of time. But, me being me, I mean, I need my brain to be kind of challenged and exercised and all those kind of things. And so in 2015, after about a year, I kind of decided to set up Spinning Red. And the idea of Spinning Red was to kind of look at, use the experience I had, but then try and work much more with scale ups and startups and smaller companies and pre seed companies, and understand what their challenges were and opportunities were, and how I could kind of blend that corporate experience into where they might need to get some more support, which was really interesting. And I did some good kind of interesting work, but, unfortunately, we work for money. We can say all these holier than thou things around what we want to do for work, but the money wasn't necessarily there and it wasn't in the right way. And so then I had an opportunity to work with Sport England on This Girl Can. And so I did a couple of months, and it was only a couple of months, but it was probably one of the most influential parts of my career was working on that campaign. Not only because the campaign is amazing, and it's the kind of the really, we talk about social impact, we talk about behavior change campaigns. This Girl Can was the campaign that really drove that understanding and thinking around how do you have a really good insight into human understanding and human behavior, and then able to influence and change that in an amazing way to cut through on the noise. And that's, so I worked on the second ad that came out, not the first one, because the first one kind of just shocked everyone, and the second one was the one where Maya Angelou narrated the story rather than having the song.
And just remind us of the central premise of This Girl Can.
The central insight is, why do women and girls stop exercising and stop being active? And the insight around it is around other people's perceptions. So it could be things like, don't wanting to be seen sweaty, don't want to be kind of, don't wanting, clothing being kind of an impact for them around, and when periods and when women girls have periods, that can stop their kind of routine of being active and having exercise. So there's a range of different ways that you saw that women and girls weren't being active in the right way, and we wanted to do is challenge that thinking and challenge that stereotype into, you can still be active. It is just about getting off the couch. It is about kind of doing what you love and what you really enjoy doing, and kind of using real women's experience and real women's kind of visuals and stories to challenge that. Like one of the most famous ones was, one of the ones where I'm a woman cycling and says, I'm lapping everyone on the couch, and that to me has often been a real driving forward of kind of like, just get up and do something and be active in some way, because whatever you do is more than someone sitting on the couch. And so that was the premise of it, and it was one of those campaigns that the insight was so fundamental to everything you did. You had everything from every social media post to any kind of PR activation, including the ad. It needed to really clearly meet that particular insight that you were trying to challenge or trying to solve. And then the measurement came on the back of that, because you're able to kind of say, well, how do people react differently, or what do people do differently? And this part of the campaign, it was also very much around building those relationships with local sporting organisations and sporting entities to kind of say, have you got the structures in place that kind of recognise what women and girls need from your site? So for example, things like, for some women it's like having women only swimming sessions, and for other people it's around kind of safety and security and kind of gym scenarios that you could, you weren't kind of being ogled and watched and all those kind of things. A big part of the campaign now, and you see it every winter, is recognising women stop running and stop being outside in darkness because of fear of violence. These things are still ongoing, and This Girl Can has had like an amazing ability to cut through that conversation really effectively. So it was a really short period of my career, but it was so influential and so impactful for me, and the stories and the memory of what I kind of, was able to do with that was great.
So, reflecting on your career to date, what's the success you're most proud of and your biggest learning experience so far?
I think I wouldn't say there's any one biggest learning experience. And I think it goes back to, I think a consistency we've talked about is around understanding who I am as a person. I think one of communications and like, stuff I've done around communicating and training courses around communications I've delivered, so much has to start from knowing who you are and your style and what your triggers are, how you want to relate to people and how you show up to people. Although I don't think you can influence other people's responses, I do think you can have an awareness of how you show up. And I haven't always shown up brilliantly. I've always, my values around openness, transparency, and honesty. And, and sometimes that can kind of not resonate with other people in the way that you expect or you want it to. And so for me, that learning of just being able to, which is an ongoing thing, I don't always get it right, that flexing your style, flexing your ability to kind of be aware of other people's preferences and how they either like to get information or to relate to people, being able to notice other people's reactions to things and then being able to adapt yourself. That to me, from a kind of human connection point of view, and has been really important. And I haven't always got it right, and I still don't always get it right. I still get frustrated and annoyed, as any normal person does. But I think they're the things that I've learned a lot more as I've gotten older and as my career has progressed, is that, we are all humans with our own baggage and our own perspectives. So therefore, an ability to be able to understand that and recognize that is a critical part of my career.
Be comfortable with that as well. I know I can speak for myself when, particularly sort of early years in my career, where you look at the most senior people and you try and emulate what they're doing and how they're speaking and how they're behaving, and actually ultimately it's not you. You have to put your own special flavour on that, and not try and be someone you're not.
No, absolutely. And also I think this is another thing about why I've decided to kind of make the choices I've made with my career now, is sometimes I would look ahead and look at more senior people and look at the compromises or the way they needed to react to things. And I looked at it and I thought, well, that's not where I want to be. That's not how I want to be. A big part for me was I wanted to kind of still be a practitioner rather than a bean counter, which is kind of like I'm with senior leadership, as it becomes a very different skill set that you require. But also it's kind of, what kind of leader do you want to be? And I think particularly people starting out in their career or kind of early or mid-career, be really conscious and aware of how other people lead and, why you either really admire, respect that person, and kind of try and unpick that around how they make you feel or how they make you either negatively, positively. And then kind of think around, how do I show up with other people? And how can I make different choices around, like what you said, am I being authentic? Am I being true to my values and how you want other people to talk about you? And, and I think that whole kind of thing of just kind of trying to build that empathy and understanding what do people say about you when you're not in the room? And I think, and I kind of think probably in my early career, people would say certain things, and I'm hoping people would say different things now. And it's that journey as kind of getting older of just observing and having more information around what does leadership entail. And from a business perspective, it's kind of, and then seeing how everything's always interconnected. So it's kind of making sure that you recognize those connections and to be able to navigate more effectively is important.
And so what's next for you? Any particular direction or destination in mind?
Look, my big milestone was I turned 50 at the end of last year, which was a big milestone in lots of ways, mentally and kind of emotionally for me. I'm very much of the Cindy Gallop school of kind of just say your age, and I've had a real problem at the moment where we're seeing a real rising incidence of ageism in kind of marketing and communications, and kind of not valuing experience and knowledge and that calmness that comes with experience and knowledge.
And which I find really bizarre, given that we've got an ageing population. The fact that actually that's not going in the favour of people with more experience, it's starting to boggle my mind slightly.
It absolutely does, and it's kind of like, and then if you think even you think commercially, the biggest market tend to be Gen X women. women are the biggest shoppers, and as far as kind of the shoppers for the household and decision makers for the household and household shopping. And so Gen X women, why, we're not, people aren't knocking on our doors constantly trying to kind of figure out and understand what makes us tick, what's important, and what we want to know. And this constant obsession with youth, which I think is fascinating. I also think it's real problematic around the kind of this tension that we're kind of creating and manufacturing around generational difference, which is also problematic. So there's a whole bit of that. And so a big part of, for me, turning 50 though, was really owning my age and my experience and my knowledge and who I am now. A big part is also giving back. So I kind of launched this kind of idea on my 50th birthday around having 50 conversations with 50 people over 50 weeks, to try and just really bolster conversation and human connection a lot more. So that's from a kind of a personal perspective. From a professional perspective, it's kind of continuing to kind of grow, learn, develop new things, new products and proposals, new training, new clients, build that pipeline, hopefully get that roller coaster to be less of a roller coaster and more kind of a static kind of understanding. And then the other big one is kind of looking at, where do I want to live in the future? I mean, I've been out of Australia this time around for 21 years. There's kind of a big conversation happening in our household at the moment around, do we see a move to Australia on the cards, which will be great. And then and just see where the world takes us. I mean, I don't tend to have often the grand plans of things. I tend to have them happen, be more responsive to what's happening and in that particular moment and see where it takes me.
But it doesn't sound like you're slowing down anytime soon.
No. God, no. And anyone who talks to anyone who's in my age is, very few. We just make different choices. I'm not involved. I find the proximity and the return to office debate and all of this kind of stuff around old structures of work really frustrating. And I think definitely not slowing down, but definitely making choices and doing things differently. And for me, that's what I want to kind of demonstrate to younger people, that you don't have to do what's always been done. You can work differently as well.
Very good. And finally, what's the best piece of career advice you've received, and what would your advice to be for someone looking to get ahead in your line of work?
I think it goes back to kind of get to know yourself, be really comfortable with who you are as a person, and be able to, and really focus on kind of listening and observing and connecting dots. I think so much of what we do is around connecting those dots together, and I think taking your own ego out of the picture and being able to kind of put yourself in the shoes of other people is a learned skill. And I think that's a really important skill that people can, the sooner they get a grasp on that, the better. I think it took me a long time. And I wish I had, a bit more understanding of what empathy meant earlier on in my career. But because I think it's a really important skill, particularly a way of building, connections with fellow humans.
Lots and lots of really good stuff there. I think some of the few notes I've taken is, yes, be authentic, be yourself, really get to know the business that you're working with, and really work on those relationships and empathy as well. So yes, lots to take away there. So thanks so much for joining us today. Really, really appreciate your time. And thanks to you for listening. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe for future episodes, leave a review, or share with your friends and colleagues. See you next time.